All right, yeah, thanks, Anders, for the introduction. Yeah, I'm Russell Callahan from the University of Connecticut, and I'll be presenting the Hydrology and Critical Zone Working Group summary. I wanted to start by thanking my other working group members listed here on the bottom, especially Brady Flensham, who is the co-chair with me for this group. So I wanted to start by just briefly talking about some terminology I'll be using today and kind of define the critical zone. So when I refer to the critical zone, I'm thinking of the area on Earth's surface from fresh rock at depth up to the surface where we have soil and saprolite, and this zone also encompasses the treetops here on the surface. And so, as you can see in this image, which is a road cut from the Front Range in Colorado, you have, unweathered rock at depth. Moving close to the surface, you start to have iron oxidation, chemical weathering starts to occur, fractures begin to open. And eventually this zone, you form soil and highly porous saprolite, which can support these terrestrial ecosystems that you see here on the top. And usually we don't have these road cuts everywhere. So we rely on drilling and some geophysical methods, which I'll talk about a little bit more, to really quantify and understand this zone on Earth's surface. So I also wanted to talk about the importance of critical zone science. So this is, So this is an area on Earth's surface where lots happens. There's vegetation and, maybe I just have to, there we go. It's getting too far away. So, and as weathering in the critical zone opens pores and fractures, there's water stored in the subsurface, permeability changes, and dictates the water movement through the subsurface, which is important for providing water to vegetation, recharging groundwater systems, and sustaining stream flow. Variations in subsurface structure and water storage capacity have also shown to influence ecosystem productivity, like in this example from the southern Sierra Nevada in California. And these variations can also influence forest drought response in the region. So ultimately, this subsurface zone, the critical zone, can help explain spatial variability in forest dieback during drought periods, which has important implications for understanding carbon, forest, and water resources, and also wildfire risk following droughts. Another important aspect of critical zone science is thinking about managed and agricultural systems. So this is a nice kind of diagram from Kumar et al. 2018. And they kind of emphasize the importance of understanding these subsurface processes when we're thinking about water and nutrient cycling in agricultural and managed landscapes, which have important implications for some kind of understanding the productivity of these agroecosystems, how these systems respond to land use change, and also water quality and quantity in these managed environments. So where does drilling and geophysics come in? So as I mentioned before, this zone is often hidden from view. We're thinking about the top, 50 to 100 meters of Earth's surface, and it's hidden beneath soil. And we rely on drilling or excavations to kind of reveal these subsurface materials and provide direct samples where we can start to look at the chemical and physical processes or properties of the subsurface. So this is an example from the Northern California Coast Range where Pedrosas and others nicely show variations in fracture density, color of these pores, and can kind of get at how deep the weathering is across these different boreholes, which span kind of variations in hill slope size in this landscape. Another powerful tool for understanding the critical zone is the use of near-surface geophysics. So specifically, in this example, we're looking at seismic refraction surveys. This is some data from the Laramie Range in Wyoming. And these variations in the P-wave velocity of the subsurface correspond to differences in subsurface weathering across the landscape. And this is also a really nice example of how pairing geophysics with these surface geophysical surveys can both provide direct observations of the different subsurface layers, and then also use the geophysics to understand the spatial heterogeneity and weathering across the landscape. Okay, so now hopefully you all are now experts in critical zone science after this brief introduction. I'm going to now get into kind of what the working group identified as kind of the main themes for future research in hydrology and critical zone, and then I'll wrap up by talking about some of the logistical and funding and needs moving forward to kind of advance these research themes. So the first thing we identified was major research theme is the controls on subsurface critical zone structure. So this is really kind of understanding the processes that drive variations in weathering and subsurface structure across landscapes. The second is controls of critical zone structure on hydrologic, geomorphic, and ecological functions. The third is interactions between humans in the deep critical zone. And the fourth is synthesis of critical zone processes across spatial and temporal scales. So for the first one, what I want to point out is that there's been a lot of progress on kind of understanding the processes that drive the variations in structure across landscapes, but ultimately we still need more measurements, and kind of coming up with a unifying theory for how subsurface weathering varies across landscapes still remains a grand challenge. And this image kind of nicely illustrates the complexity of this problem. So this is an image showing kind of 4 hypotheses for different processes that drive variations in subsurface weathering beneath hill slopes, specifically due to differences in topography. And these hypotheses talk about things like regional stress regimes, the flow of groundwater beneath hill slopes, how variations in slope aspect drive differences in temperature. And this kind of just demonstrates the complexity with really trying to understand the main processes driving critical zone weathering in a given landscape. The other component for theme 1 is thinking about how underlying bedrock properties influence subsurface weathering. So this includes thinking about things like the underlying fracture density, the foliation of the underlying bedrock, and also the bedrock composition. And I think this is a nice example of how the underlying geology matters. This is a schematic from some results from the Santa Catalina Mountains in Arizona, where Leone and others nicely showed that the weathering is much deeper on this south-facing hill slope, where the foliation of the underlying bedrock is perpendicular to the hill slope, allowing water to infiltrate and increase subsurface weathering. In contrast, on this other hill slope where the foliation is parallel to the slope, water is not able to infiltrate, and the weathering is actually much thinner on this hill slope. So this is just a nice example of how really quantifying the underlying geology is really important for understanding the critical zone weathering. The second theme is kind of understanding how critical zone structure influences hydrologic, geomorphic, and ecological functions. This first example, I wanted to talk about the geomorphology and how this weathering zone really impacts surface processes. So variations in subsurface critical zone structure drive variations in rock strength and hill slope sediment size, which can in turn dictate erosion rates, channel incision rates, and ultimately long-term rates of landscape evolution. So this is a nice schematic kind of showing how different variations in fracture density and weathering can dictate hill slope, the grain size of hill slope sediment, which has important geomorphic implications. In the next example, I wanted to talk about the importance for ecological functions. So this zone on Earth's surface, chemical and physical weathering, opens fractures and pore space. And this zone is where plants access their water. So the amount of weathering can actually dictate the amount of subsurface storage that's available to plants. And additionally, the breakdown of rock releases nutrients that are vital to plant growth, and microorganisms in the critical zone, as we just talked about in the last talk. So this zone on Earth's surface is vital to plants, but there's still a lot of remaining questions about kind of feedbacks between vegetation, microorganisms, and critical zone weathering. And the last example for this theme, I wanted to talk about connections between the subsurface and hydrologic processes. So this is some work I did as a postdoc where we quantified subsurface weathering and fracturing in the California Coast Range. And as you can see here, or maybe you can if you're in the back, this rock is highly fractured in the subsurface. And following drilling, we actually instrumented these boreholes with groundwater loggers, level loggers. And we came up with this conceptual model showing how variations in fracture density and influence the water table and how deep meteoric water circulates in the subsurface, which in this semi-arid landscape has important implications for thinking about groundwater recharge rates and stream flow generation. And for the next theme, we identified was the interactions between humans in the deep critical zone. And one nice example of this is thinking about geologic hazards. So this work by Alberti and others, they compiled a bunch of measurements of landslides across Oregon and suggest that the variations in the subsurface weathering and fracture density actually influence the initiation and type of landslides, which can pose significant hazards to communities in mountainous areas. So this is kind of a nice example of how understanding the critical zone is directly relevant to human populations. And then in the last example for theme 3, I just wanted to talk about the interactions between the critical zone and hydrology. So this is the USGS, new updated USGS water cycle diagram. And ultimately, understanding the critical zone is important for understanding how much water is stored in the subsurface, kind of the time scales of water movement. And this is obviously very important for understanding water quantity and quality in the face of climate change and increased human use. And one thing that our working group wanted to emphasize is the need to think about these problems across a wide range of environments, including mountain headwater systems, coastal and alluvial aquifers, as well as urban and agricultural settings. Now, the last theme is the synthesis of CSD processes over spatial and temporal scales. So oftentimes critical zone studies are focused on individual hill slopes or small catchments. This is a nice kind of summary diagram of some geophysical measurements of weathering across a few different landscapes. And while I think hopefully have demonstrated the importance of quantifying this subsurface layer and the subsurface critical zone structure, it is still lacking for most Earth system models. So we need the ability to scale up to larger spatial scales. There's been some recent work which has nicely showed that you can pair drilling and geophysical measurements with remote sensing and topographic data to kind of scale up estimates of critical zone structure across kind of regional to large watershed scales. This is an example from the DOE East River Science Focus Area in Colorado. But ultimately, to get at continental and global scale problems, we need the ability to scale up measurements and maybe also think about ways to use existing data sets from boreholes or geophysics to quantify critical zone structure across larger spatial scales. And the last part of this is thinking about different temporal scales. So from estimates of subsurface thickness and estimates of erosion rates from cosmogenic nuclides, we can show that critical zone weathering often integrates over 10,000 to even million-year timescales, which often integrates over periods of substantial climatic change. And so to kind of understand the role of past climates in dictating critical zone structure, we need to integrate paleoclimate information into conceptual models of critical zone weathering, which requires collaborative projects with paleoclimatologists and potentially working in areas where we have detailed paleoclimate records. Okay, so now that I've outlined these research themes, let's talk about the community needs to advance this research. So the first need is the development and standardization of drilling, logging, and sampling techniques, interdisciplinary collaboration around drilling projects, and then the third is synthesis of new and existing measurements. So one of the challenges we often face when we drill in the critical zone is that we have the critical zone hosts a variety of materials, including soft soil and weathered bedrock, crumbly weathered bedrock with numerous fractures, and then also harder weathered bedrock with minimal fracturing. So as you can imagine, this requires using multiple different types of drilling techniques, and we often struggle with recovering intact samples and capturing the transitions between these different zones. So we need to think about drilling technologies that can kind of allow us to capture this zone without without compromising sample recovery. Additionally, many critical zone studies take place in difficult to access areas with steep topography. This requires drilling equipment that can access these areas, as well as working with drill teams that are comfortable working in these steep landscapes. And then also, one of the challenges is, as critical zone scientists, we are often interested in sampling a variety of materials, including water, rock, soil, microbes, as we talked about, or the last talk nicely illustrated some of the challenges with the microbial sampling. But these, depending on the project goals, this often requires creative sampling techniques, depending on the specific project goals. One thing I wanted to emphasize is this is kind of a creative example of some of the sampling techniques used in the critical zone. This is a Veda zone monitoring system where you use a diagonal borehole with water samplers and water content sensors that capture different flow paths at varying lengths in the subsurface. So this is just kind of an example of some of the creative drilling projects and sampling designs that are used in critical zone science. The next need is interdisciplinary collaboration around drilling projects. Critical zone drilling can be challenging, and drilling techniques and completion techniques may vary depending on project goals. So one thing that the community, or that our working group identified, is that the community needs resources documenting the benefits and limitations of different drilling and borehole completion techniques for complementary research questions. And part of our working group has actually spun off to work on a manuscript on challenges and opportunities in critical zone drilling. This is being led by Amanda Donaldson at UT Austin. And we also have an AGU poster this year on Thursday afternoon. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to check this out. And then along with that collaboration, we also needed to think about strategies for funding collaborative work. We know drilling is expensive, so as much as we can bring in people with different expertise to make the most of these drilling projects, I think that would be beneficial for everyone involved. So this involves getting people from diverse backgrounds and expertise involved with the drilling projects, and also thinking about ways to get funding to conduct geophysical logging and instrumentations of boreholes following drilling. And then also thinking about funding opportunities for additional analyses and instrumentation on existing drill projects, including projects outside of the critical zone community. Some of the other examples here have talked about drilling to kilometers depth. We're really thinking about the top 50 to 100 meters. So oftentimes I think these other projects drill through that zone, but may not care about it as much as we do. So there could potentially be some collaboration to make the most of those projects, depending on project goals and things like that. The last need is the synthesis of new and existing measurements. So ultimately, we need more drilling campaigns aimed at testing emerging critical zone hypotheses. This is just a map of the critical zone observatories, which were previously funded by the National Science Foundation. And this isn't an all-encompassing map of places where we've drilled the critical zone, but it at least provides a first order estimate. But one thing that our working group identified is that there's a lot of difficult to access but understudied areas where we really don't have a good understanding of the critical zone. This includes tropical regions, high mountains, and Arctic regions. So we need to think about strategies for kind of expanding critical zone science to some of these other landscapes. And the last thing is compiling existing measurements. So one thing we identified was if there's a way to take existing borehole core and geophysical data and put it into publicly available databases using kind of these fair best practices, that would kind of help with some of our scaling up. We also wanted to develop strategies to compare measurements between sites, such as conducting standardized analyses on archived cores and new and existing boreholes. And then finally, we need workshops to come up with strategies for synthesizing data across sites using conceptual frameworks, computational models, and data analytics. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions if we have time.